All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Hard to Be Human. I am your host, Chad Rogers. In today's episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about trying to find meaning, purpose, and value in life. Now, if you've read my book, you know that there is a chapter on that. We're going to be doing something a little bit different today. We're going to be approaching it with a different person's story than I use in the book. So if you've read that chapter, definitely stay tuned because this is going to be slightly different than what I did there. So we're going to be looking at trying to find meaning, purpose, and value in our lives, but we're also going to be talking briefly about a philosophical position called existentialism. Nothing technical, but what we're going to find is that as we're looking for meaning, purpose, and value, uh, and then we start talking about the existential position, you're going to see these kind of two bookend positions that are very far away from each other. So it's going to make for a really, really interesting pairing, talking about that value and then talking about the existentialist and their perspective as well. So for today, in order to help us to start thinking about finding meaning, purpose, and value in life, we are going to be talking about the life and the work of a fellow named Viktor Frankl. And if you've not read his book, Man's Search for Meaning, it is definitely worth the read. A lot of what I'm going to be doing today is going to be pulled from his writings there. But just kind of trying to run through a bit of his story and then taking a look at some of the work that he did with a technique in psychology called logotherapy. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to find that meaning, purpose, and value in our own lives because that's the foundation for everything else that we want to do or think about or strive for in this podcast, but then also in our lives as well. So, laying this foundation, finding that meaning, purpose, and value, that's where you have to start. And so, we're going to use Frankl's story and a little bit about his teachings as well, but that's kind of what we're after in this episode. So, first of all, talking just a little bit about Viktor Frankl's story. Frankl was an Austrian Jewish psychiatrist who began working with potential suicide victims in Europe around 1926. And he's going to develop that technique that I was talking about called logotherapy, but we're going to talk more about that kind of toward the middle-ish end of the episode. So for now, I'm just going to leave it and just say that he's working with potential suicide victims. Now, Frankl is going to remain in Europe to take care of his aging parents after the beginning of World War II. And then in 1942, he is going to be arrested by the Germans. He is Jewish. He's arrested by the Germans and he's going to be sent to the first of his concentration camps. And over the next 3+ years, he's going to be in 4 different camps. Now, he said that as he entered his first camp, he was sorted with the rest of the prisoners. They're going to sort them males and females, but then they will also sort them based on whether or not they look like they're healthy and they can work, because a lot of these camps are also going to be labor intensive, and they're going to take a lot of the people who can work, they're going to take them out and they're going to put them to work, as we'll see here with Frankl. So with Frankl, as he's being sorted, he looked like he was healthy enough to work, so they kept him alive. But for those who didn't look like they were healthy enough to work, those are the individuals who are going to be put to death. The work conditions in these camps were brutal. The guards were brutal, and the living accommodations were brutal as well. Frankl describes the starvation in the camps by telling us that prisoners were given very, very watery soup every day and a small piece of bread. And he commented several times on how you would be lucky if you had a pea in your soup that day. That's how watery the soup was. And so he commented on that multiple times about how fortunate it was just to get something like a pea. Now, you could get extra food by doing some kind of work detail, or you could trade your cigarettes to the guards and get extra food that way. But starvation in these camps was very, very prevalent. Now, after several months of being in the camp with insufficient food and being being worked continuously in very strenuous and very, very difficult environments, uh, Frankel begins to weaken. But one of his fellow prisoners came to him, a fellow who had been in the camps a lot longer than Frankel had, and he told him that he should look as healthy as possible every day, and he should look as young as he can every day. And so he told Frankel, just never slouch no matter how much pain you're in, and shave every single day, because by shaving you look younger, you're going to look healthier. And he said shave even if you have to use a piece of broken glass. Be sure that you shave every day, because if the guards think that you're too weak to work, then there's no reason to keep you alive. Now, along with starvation in the camps, the working conditions, as I said, those were brutal as well. The prisoners would often work below freezing temperatures and would often work in the snow as well. The clothes that they had were rags. They were insufficient to keep them warm. The boots that they had were falling apart. If they came into the camps and they had sturdy shoes, those shoes would be taken from them and would be given to the people of Germany or the soldiers who were on the line. And so then their shoes would just be replaced with these broken down old shoes that really didn't do anything to protect the prisoners' feet. They didn't have any socks. And if they were working in snow, that meant that these boots weren't keeping the snow out. The snow would simply come in and pack in those boots around their feet. And so most of the prisoners had some kind of frostbite as well. At night, the prisoners would come back to their barracks where there was no heat. And they also didn't have blankets. They had rags, but they didn't have blankets to keep them warm. And they also often lived in their own filth because the accommodations in the barracks were insufficient to take care of the human waste that was coming out of the prisoners there as well. Now, Frankel claimed that the conditions that they were living in and working in were bad, but that wasn't the worst part of the camp experience. He said that part of the goal of these camps was to dehumanize, and it was to try to take away your own personal identity as well. And so when the prisoners came into the camps for the first time, the guards would assign them a number, and that number would be tattooed on their arm, and they would no longer be called by their name. They would only be addressed by that number. The guards would take all personal possessions from them, even if that possession had no monetary value to anyone at all. If it had no value to anyone except for that prisoner, they still took all the possessions, because the idea here was to try to strip these people, try to strip the prisoners of all attachments to their past, to who they were. The guards wanted to dehumanize them, and they wanted to take their identity. And so no one was allowed to keep any of their personal possessions. And if you were found trying to hide and keep some of your possessions, you would be beaten. Also, one of the first tasks that prisoners were assigned when they came into the camp was to clean the latrines. And Frankel said that if those new people, if they were cleaning the latrine and some human waste like splattered on their face, if they flinched, then the guards would beat them as well. There was one personal incident that Frankel recalled where he was working on a particularly difficult detail. It was very, very cold, and so he had to work hard in order to try to keep warm. But the trouble was that he was already starting to face starvation conditions, and so working hard enough to keep himself warm was very, very difficult. So at one point, he's just trying to catch his breath, and he's leaning on the handle of the tool that he had been working with. He said a guard picked up a pebble and just hit him in the back with it, like threw it and hit him in the back. And Frankel said that the pebble hurt a little bit, but that wasn't really what caused him the most pain. He said that the emotional pain that was attached to this incident was much more difficult to bear, because he said it was almost like he was a dog who had been misbehaving and got caught, and he wasn't even worth the effort for the guard to go over there and beat him, and instead he simply just hit him with a pebble. So he said emotionally that was a very, very difficult thing to face. Now, to cope with the extreme conditions, especially the depersonalizing and the dehumanizing aspects of this, Frankel said that the prisoners had to become emotionally numb. They just had to shut down all of their emotions completely, and that would allow them, that numbness would kind of allow them to continue on, because they just wouldn't be bombarded by this constant just emotional battle that they would have been facing if they hadn't shut themselves down emotionally. And Frankel gave a really interesting story about this emotional shutdown. Because Frankel had some medical training, sometimes he would be selected to be the doctor for the prisoners in the camp. Now, there would be a hospital, but again, you can't think of some kind of hospital like we would expect where you would send someone to try to get well. Hospitals for the prisoners weren't to try to keep them alive. It was just somewhere to send them, and if they died, that's fine. And if they lived, they would eventually just go back to work, if they had recovered enough and were strong enough to go back to work. So it's not a hospital to try and save them. It's just somewhere that they can go until they either die or they recover. The medicine that they had there for the prisoners was really just some aspirin, and Frankel said they didn't have very much of it, so they would cut it in half, and they would only give it to people that they thought had a chance to actually survive. And so again, it's not a place to save people's lives. It's just somewhere for them to go until they die or recover. So Frankel said that one time he was there in the hospital as the doctor, and he remembered talking to a man, and he was very certain that this man wasn't going to live. And so he didn't give him any of the aspirin. He just talked to him some, and eventually the man did in fact die. And he said that he had an orderly, just another prisoner who was also, starving like all the prisoners. And he had that orderly take the man's body out of the hospital. But the orderly, as I said, was also starving, and so he didn't have the strength to carry the man's body out with any kind of dignity. He just said that the orderly grabbed the man by his heels and dragged him out of the hospital. And so the man's head thumped down every single step as he was being dragged out. And the orderly placed the man's body beside the wall outside of the hospital, and it was next to the window where Frankel was sitting. And so Frankel could see the man that he had been talking to less than an hour before the man had passed. And Frankel said he was just sitting there eating his soup, looking out the window at that dead man's face. And he said he felt absolutely nothing because he had shut down all of his emotions, and because death was so prevalent and just so common in the camps, the prisoners just had to just kind of turn themselves off to it. They became so very numb to the fact of that a few moments ago you were talking to this man, now he's dead, and now he's sitting here. And Frankel said he was just sitting there eating his soup, looking at the man. Frankel said he wouldn't even really have remembered this incident, but as a psychiatrist, he said that he was curious about his own mental condition at that moment, during that moment as he was eating his soup, staring at the man. He said that was the only reason he remembered it. Just kind of gives you an idea of not just the physical aspect, the physical challenges of surviving this concentration camp, but also the mental and emotional challenges of facing this camp as well. Now, in 1945, after Germany's defeat, Frankel was liberated, and he said that he thought he would experience some kind of joy from surviving and gaining his freedom, but he said that he and his fellow prisoners felt absolutely nothing because they had shut themselves down for so long that eventually, when they started getting some emotions back, the only two emotions that they experienced were bitterness and disillusionment. Now, bitterness kind of makes sense because they were bitter toward the Germans, toward those people who had done this to them, who had taken so much from them. And so they were bitter towards them, but they were also, he said, disillusioned because as the prisoners went kind of out and started trying to go back to the places that they were from, and they would share their stories, there was this kind of disillusionment because as they shared the stories, people kind of looked at them and shrugged. They were like, yeah, okay, all right, sorry that was your experience. But the simple fact was that so many people had suffered so greatly during the war that it was hard for them to then just really care extra about what had happened to these prisoners because everyone had suffered, everyone had experienced loss. And so the prisoners, didn't get that kind of extra attention that they kind of thought they might have deserved. And so there was a certain amount of disillusionment there as well. Now, Frankl didn't know it until after the war and until after his liberation. He knew that his father had died because he died there in that concentration camp with Frankl. But what Frankl didn't know until after the war was that he'd also lost his mother, his brother, his wife, and their unborn child as well. He had no family left, and so he had fully and completely lost his entire family. And Frankl claimed that when it came to himself and the different prisoners that he had talked with, that there were a few things that really drove the prisoners to try to survive. And many of the prisoners gave up hope, and that's why they died. But for Frankl and some of these other prisoners, he said, they had something to live for. They had something that they wanted enough that they strived, they fought to survive in those concentration camps. Now, if you remember at the beginning of this, I said that Frankl worked with people who were at risk for committing suicide, and he was using a technique called logotherapy that he created. It was his brainchild. And Frankl began working on this manuscript again. And I say again because the manuscript that he had created when he went into the concentration camp, that was taken from him. And so now, after that war is over, he is starting to work on this manuscript on logotherapy again because he understood the significance of what he was doing. Now, he had had great success with this technique, with this therapy to keep people from committing suicide, but now he's seeing it even in a broader use, a greater way of trying to help people who were looking for meaning, value, and purpose in life. Now, the word logo, L-O-G-O, the word logo in logotherapy comes from a Greek word logos, L-O-G-O-S. And the word logos in Greek is usually translated as word. So the word logos is translated word. And in that context, it's fine, but in our context with Frankl and what he's doing, a better, a more appropriate translation for this word is probably the reason for it all. So this idea of the reason for it all, logos can mean the reason for it all. So the word logos there, you could use it, for example, to begin a court case. And so if one person was suing another person, if they wrote up their document there, the lawyer might have wrote it up and said, the logos for this lawsuit is blah, 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 blah. Or the reason for all of this lawsuit is blah, 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 blah. And so it can mean the reason for it all. If you're familiar with John chapter 1, verse 1, you can translate that verse as, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But you could also translate that verse as, in the beginning was the reason for it all, and the reason for it all was with God, and the reason for it all was God. And so again, this idea of logos, word, or the reason for it all, especially in Frankl's case. Now, in the beginning, Frankl's logotherapy focused on helping people to find a reason not to commit suicide. But after having lived through the death camp, he becomes this kind of walking, talking, living example of the power of logotherapy, because while he's there in that death camp, he understands that he has to have a very, very powerful, a very, very strong why to be able to survive, or he's going to lose hope and he's just going to give up and die. Now, Nietzsche said that he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. And Frankl's going to kind of embrace that idea of, finding that why. And for Frankl, in the camp, he knew that he had two very, very powerful reasons to try and survive the concentration camp. And the first one was that he wanted to see his family again. And the second one was he wanted to continue his work on logotherapy. And so for those two reasons, Frankl's really, really going to strive and battle to survive the camps, because he wants to see his family and he wants to continue his work. Now, let me just kind of add here something that I think is really, really powerful and meaningful. In some of his post-camp reflections, Frankl points out this thing that I think is just tremendously illuminating. He says that far too often people look out into the universe and they're asking the universe what their meaning and what their purpose is. But what Frankl says is that it's the opposite. We shouldn't be looking out into the universe trying to find that purpose, but rather we should be looking inside. And here's what he said. So here's a quote from Frankl. Quote, "We are not asking the universe the meaning of our lives, but that the universe is looking at us, asking us the meaning of our lives." And so what he's saying here is that it's not that we should be looking externally. We shouldn't be looking out there to something outside of ourselves to give us that meaning and purpose, but instead we should be looking internally. We should be looking inside of ourselves. And what he says is not just that that's what we should be doing. Not that just we should be looking internally, but he says the universe is looking at you and saying, and I'm looking at you, and you figure this out for you tell me. We tell the universe. It comes from inside of us, and we tell the universe what our meaning and our purpose is. Now, psychological studies have shown that the most powerful whys, or the most powerful meanings in our life, they do come from inside of us. It's not what other people expect from us that is the most powerful, that somehow allows or inspires us to change or to strive, or whatever it is that we need to do. The most powerful whys, the most powerful meanings come from inside of ourselves. And so in this episode, I really want to try to encourage you to begin to examine yourself, to dive deep into yourself and try to understand what's the most significant, most valuable, most meaningful things in your life. And that's really that foundation that I was talking about at the beginning of this episode. Once you find that foundation, then you can start building all of the different other aspects around your life, or you can start shaping them around your life, as we'll talk about here in just a moment. Now, this question of what do we value or what's meaningful to us sometimes can be mistaken for a search for pleasure or even a search for happiness. And that's really not what we should be striving before, because pleasure and happiness are both, they're fleeting. They come and they go. They're momentary, and then they're going to be gone. And what happens is that if you start engaging in this idea of that life is about finding meaning and pleasure, you're going to run into what Frankl calls an existential vacuum. Now, this idea of an existential vacuum, we know what a vacuum is, but this idea of what's the existential part of this. And this is where we're going to talk briefly about existentialism. So trying to understand this idea of existential vacuum, briefly, what is existentialism? Honestly, existentialism is kind of an odd duck. Most philosophical positions have an overarching theme that kind of unites all the people within that philosophical position. Existentialism is the oddball. It does have some themes, but there are really, really diverse ideas that are kind of housed in this particular position. But for our purposes, let's just say that for the most part, most existentialists have this idea that within human existence, there is no meaning, there is no purpose. We could have value, but all that the value is just whatever we assign value to, but it's just kind of random and up to the individual. It's all subjective, but there is no meaning and there is no purpose beyond our just simple own desires or wants or strivings. And so that's it. And when you read these existentialist writers, you're going to get an overarching sense of probably the easiest and best word is just anxiety, because there's a lot of angst in life as we go through it, because there are so many trials and tribulations, and according to them, to most of them, not all of them, most of them are atheists. Once you die, that's it. And so there is just a lot of anxiety that is attached to this. And so this idea of anxiety or dread, you'll see that kind of idea a lot as well. One of my favorites is that some of these writers think of life as an absurd joke that the universe is playing on us. And so just a quick quote to kind of, reinforce this idea of absurdity, anxiety, all those things. The existentialist Voltaire describes man's condition as, quote, tormented atoms in a bit of mud, devoured by death and a mockery of fate, end quote. So in the quote, again, you can see this kind of anxiety, the dread, the absurdity. Again, not all existentialists agree necessarily on this, but that's kind of an overarching theme for most existentialists. So that's the kind of position, that's that kind of existential vacuum that Frankl is contending with. What he's saying is that there is meaning and there is purpose in human existence, and it's kind of on us to find those things and to figure those things out. Now, remember that I said that the search for pleasure or happiness would result in what Frankl called that existential vacuum. Now, there is the existential writer Camus, who basically just said, go out and live your life and enjoy it, because that's all you've got, right? And so, again, Frankl's taking the opposite position of Camus, right? So that bookend thing I was talking about a while ago. And part of the reason for this is because Frankl understands that when you merely indulge in searching for pleasure or happiness, eventually the pleasure or the happiness that those things or people bring to you, it's going to fade. It's the thrill is just going to leave those experiences. And so there is a chemical reason for this. There's something called dopamine that has a lot to do with our drive and what we experience with pleasure and happiness. We're going to talk about dopamine more extensively in a future podcast, so I'm not going to go into that right now. But just so you know, there's actually a chemical reason that you begin to lose interest in those things that once brought you pleasure. But, even in the ancient world, the ancient hedonists knew that you could only indulge yourself for so long in certain pleasureful activities, and eventually that pleasure is going to fade. Now, just kind of two quick examples here. I remember I had some video games that I used to play that brought me a lot of pleasure, and then after a while they didn't any longer. And so if you've ever had that experience of either playing something or being involved in some type of activity, and then it just the thrill wears off, basically. If you can't really relate to something like that, maybe think of a lot of the celebrities that we know about who constantly seem to be searching for that happiness or that pleasure, and they might find it for a while. They'll find it maybe in a new relationship. And this is why celebrities so often go through so many different relationships, because you'll find pleasure in a relationship for a time, but eventually that kind of intoxicating pleasure that you get at the beginning, it's going to fade, it's going to go away. And so for a lot of them, what they think is that they've fallen out of love, or they've just lost interest, or they've grown apart. I mean, you use the phrase that you want, but that's a very common experience. We see it in celebrities because we know about them, but it happens within all relationships, because relationships change over time. We know this. But anyway, the point here is that eventually that initial and kind of intoxicating pleasure is going to fade. It's going to change. And so the celebrities, they go out and they look for new people to bring that feeling of pleasure or happiness back to them. Or maybe they indulge themselves in fancy vacations, or really expensive toys, whether it's cars or boats or whatever it might be. But eventually, those toys are also going to lose that effect of bringing that pleasure to their lives. And what do they have to do? They'll have to go out and get new toys. And so there's this kind of continuous searching, this what's called a hedonistic treadmill, where they're out there and they're constantly striving to try and find this happiness, but it just keeps fading. And that really is part of the human condition. And so you have to understand that that is fleeting, it's fading, and that's not meaning or value in your life. Searching for pleasure or searching for happiness, it's if you keep doing it, you're just going to have to look for it in every moment, because it's going to disappear after each moment. Now, there's nothing wrong with searching for pleasure and happiness. I think that we should enjoy them every opportunity that we get. But there's more to life than just that. So it's not just that that's what we're after, because there's something more meaningful, there's something more valuable, and there's a purpose out there that we can pursue once we begin to understand that it's not about pleasure and it's not about happiness. Now, just as a quick aside, because I love telling people this, but every time I talk about this idea of, there's pleasure and it's fleeting and it goes away and blah, 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 I can hear B.B. King singing "The Thrill Is Gone" in the back of my mind. You're welcome for that. It's got nothing to do with anything. If you've never heard the song, go look it up. It's one of my favorites of his. It's a great song. Yeah, B.B. King, "The Thrill Is Gone," just so you know. So, right. So, like I said, it's that hedonistic treadmill. We don't want to hop on the treadmill and start looking for this pleasure and trying to, fill our life with that, because that's not what it's about. That's not going to bring us purpose or meaning. It's not what we value. Now, this to say, and to kind of put that other bookend up on the opposite end of where Frankl's position is, but now bringing it back to Frankl and the concentration camp and logotherapy. To avoid the existential vacuum and to avoid the hedonistic treadmill, we need to consider what would be meaningful enough to you, what's important enough to you, what's valuable enough to you, that you would be determined, that you would strive with everything inside of yourself to survive the concentration camp in order to be able to protect or preserve, or to be able to, in this case, embrace Frankl, in Frankl's case, to embrace his family again, or to continue his work in logotherapy. Let me broaden this just a little bit. What is so significant to you? What's so valuable to you that you would literally fight, kill, or die in order to protect or preserve that thing? What's so significant to you? You would face the incredible obstacles that came in front of Frankl, that he was determined to survive. What's so valuable to you? What's so meaningful to you? You would strive through incredible conditions in order to survive, so that you could, embrace or be part of, protect, or preserve those things again. Now, when I do this in front of a live audience, I hit pause at this point, I ask for responses, and there's always, this kind of interaction of people. I usually have to repeat the question, what's so important to you? What's so valuable to you that you would literally fight, kill, die in order to protect or preserve it? Because, it's kind of hard to register that sometimes. And so I'm going to spill that out again a couple of times probably. So I ask that question, and then I ask for hands, and hands start going up. And I've got 3 answers that are my top 3. the number one answer, the one I get every single time, and it's almost always first, is family. I always get it, and it's almost always first. Now, I've got two others behind this, the second and the third. I don't always get both of these. Sometimes I get one, not the other. Sometimes both. It just kind of depends on the audience and where their brain's at that time. But the three top answers that I get most often, number one is family, number two is faith, and number three is freedom. I almost always get those three in some kind of combination. Three most popular answers that I get. I think here, though, as I share with these people, one of the really significant things about this is that the list of things that you would fight, kill, or die in order to protect or preserve, that list is always very, very short. Now, I call the things on this list, I call them your primary purposes. They're primary because they're the most important. This is it. Everything else, comes after them. There are things that I call secondary purposes, just by the way. We're not going to talk about it today. But just so you know, there are some things that maybe you wouldn't fight, kill, die, or fight, kill, or die in order to protect or preserve them, but they're significant to you. So there are secondary purposes. But primary purposes are the ones that are absolutely, without a doubt, the most valuable. And they are the ones that we should center our lives around. Everything that we do should revolve around your list of primary purposes. And I say list of primary purposes because here, let me encourage you, if you need to stop the podcast and write down a list, then absolutely do so. Now, if you want to wait till the end, that's fine too. But I very, very much encourage you to make a list. Make a list. I like to use sticky notes. I'm kind of a sticky noteaholic. They're everywhere. I think it drives my wife crazy. So I try to keep them kind of hidden from her, but I've got sticky notes that tell me things, that remind me of things, not just primary purposes, but other things that I think are significant. So what I encourage you to do, sticky note, write this down. Here's my primary purposes, whether it's family or faith or freedom, whatever it might be. Here are the things that I want to center my life around. You make a list, you put it up here where you can see it. And if sticky notes don't work for you, but you want to be sure that you keep this with you for all times and all places so that you make sure that you're living your life, that life of meaning and value that you want, I encourage people, get a tattoo. Get a tattoo on your forearm. Here's a list of my primary purposes, and they are ... Here's what I live my life for. This is what everything else is centered around. So make that list, put it somewhere that you're going to see it so that you can remember constantly to live your life for the things on your primary purposes list, the things that you would fight, kill, or die in order to preserve or protect. Now, what's really important here too is not just what's on the list. Obviously, what's on the list is significant, but what's really important here too, what's really revealing is what's not on the list. No one has ever raised their hand and said to me, I would fight, kill, or die in order to protect or preserve my right to watch cat videos on YouTube or to scroll endlessly for hours on social media. Nobody has ever said that to me. My question then, once I, look at them and I say, no one's ever said this to me, my question to my audience is always the same. It is, then why are you spending so much time on things that you don't consider to be of primary value? Why are you spending so much time on YouTube or on social media or watching television or whatever it is that you might be doing that's not ultimately valuable to you? Why are you wasting so much of your time? Guys, we have 3 what I call non-renewable resources. Now, non-renewable meaning you only get so much of them and you're not going to get more in your lifetime. The first one I've already given to you, and that's time. We all know that we only have a certain amount of time, and nobody knows how much time they have. Any of us could die at any moment. You've only got so much time in your life, and you don't know how much you have. You need to be certain that you're spending your time on things that you consider to be valuable so that you don't waste your life. That's the first non-renewable resource. The second one is money. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, I can always make more money, and that's true, you can. But you will only make so much money in your life, and you don't know how much that is. And you need to be spending that money on things that you consider to be valuable so that you don't waste that money. The third one is energy. And energy is kind of tricky. And so let me explain it this way. Have you ever come home at the end of a long day or a long week and you're exhausted, and when you walk in the door, someone who's significant to you, whether that's a spouse, family member, roommate, doesn't make any difference, friend, you walk in the door, you see that person who's significant to you, they want to have a meaningful conversation with you, and you look at them and you say, I just don't have the energy for this. Now, if you've ever had that experience, you know what I'm talking about here, because you've only got so much energy in a day or in a week. Sometimes it's physical energy, sometimes it's emotional energy, whatever that might look like, whatever it might be for you, you've only got so much of it. You need to be sure that you're spending your energy on things that are valuable to you. And so we've got these three resources that we need to be sure that we're using them to focus on and live for our primary purposes, so that at the end of our lives, we don't have the experience that so many people have of feeling like they wasted their life. So those primary purposes, everything should revolve around them. They should be given absolute priority over everything else. As I said, there are secondary purposes. There's a time to, take a break from different things, but ultimately we need to be focused on those things that are the most valuable, the most significant, that bring us purpose and meaning in our lives. For Frankl, he survived the concentration camps because he wanted to see his family and he wanted to work on logotherapy. Now, it's really, really up to you. You should be looking inside yourself. Remember that universe is not going to tell you. The universe is not going to tell you, what your meaning and your purpose is. You're going to have to look inside yourself and say, here, this is it. These are the things that I want to live my life for. These are the things that I want to spend my resources on so that I can live a life of value, that I can live a life that has meaning and purpose. Now, here at the end, just let me say that this process that I've just outlined for you for finding what is valuable is really, really simple. It's simple in the sense that this is not a complex philosophical construct that you have to work your way through and just really struggle to try and understand. This is not a difficult concept to understand. It's really just a story, and then me asking you some questions to try to get you to think about what's valuable to you and for you and in your life. So it's not complex. It's not difficult. However, applying this to your life is not easy. There's going to be times when this is going to be really, really difficult. It's going to be a struggle. So I'm going to give you some helpful tips and tricks in the future episodes that are going to help you with the process of trying to apply these things to your life. But it just, if you understand that if you try to do this, if you try to live for those primary purposes, you are going to struggle. That's going to be part of it. We all do it. If you're trying to live for things that are valuable, you might think maybe that should be easier, and it's not necessarily. It's focused. It gives you an area to say, this is where my focus is, this is where I spend my resources, but it doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. So I would say that it is simple, but it's not easy. But then what would you expect? After all, it is hard to be human. Now, if you found this to be valuable, please like it and subscribe, and I will see you next time.